The Furnished Room by the American writer O. Henry was published in 1902, the same year that he relocated to New York City, where this, as well as many of his other stories, is set. A prolific short story writer, O. Henry, whose real name was William Henry Porter, tended to feature the struggles of everyday working-class characters, and often finished a story with a twist or surprise ending. And this tale is no exception. Taking place over the course of a single evening, The Furnished Room is divided into two parts. The first part tells the story of an anonymous young man's anguished search for his lost love in the theatrical district of Manhattan's Lower West Side. We learn that she has run away from home, presumably with dreams of becoming famous as a singer in the theatres on Broadway, and that he has come to the big city to track her down. He has, however, already had 5 dispiriting months of going from door to door, asking for information as to her whereabouts, which sadly has not been forthcoming. In need of somewhere new to stay, he has been fruitlessly ringing the bells of the once opulent but now seedy and dilapidated mansions that have become boarding houses, offering already furnished rooms for rent. At the 12th house, he is informed by its somewhat sinister housekeeper that she does indeed have a vacancy, and she shows him up to the room. Paying in advance for a week, he asks her if the name Eloise Vashner is familiar, and gives her a physical description, even including that she has a dark mole near her left eyebrow. But the housekeeper says that she has no recollection of such a girl. This seemingly minor physical detail will come to take on the utmost importance at the end of the story. Left alone, the young man senses that the room is trying to communicate with him, as its condition and the items left behind by its various temporary occupants seem to speak of their often violent and frustrating daily lives. All of a sudden, the young man is overcome by the smell of mignonette, Eloise's signature fragrance, and he becomes convinced that she has been in the room after all. In a frenzy, he almost tears the room apart in a bid to find something that she may have left behind as proof that she has been there. Unable to find any trace of her, however, he goes to find the housekeeper to quiz her on the room's previous occupants. But no description that she gives him matches that of Eloise. He returns to the room to discover that the scent has vanished as quickly as it appeared, and so, in despair, decides to end his misery by stuffing all the cracks in the room with torn bedsheets and switching on the gas. The second and final part of the story focuses on the housekeeper, Mrs. Purdy, and a fellow landlady, Mrs. McCool, as they share a can of beer at the end of the day. Mrs. McCool congratulates Mrs. Purdy on having found a tenant for the room, even though the last occupant, a young girl, committed suicide there with the gas. Mrs. Purdy reveals that she withheld that particular piece of information from the young man because she thought it might put him off staying in the room. She ends by remarking that the young girl would have been considered good-looking if it weren't for that mole she had a-growing by her left eyebrow. The reader is left with a sudden chill as they realise not only that the young man has inadvertently and ironically become reunited with Eloise in death instead of in life, as they have both committed suicide by exactly the same means, in exactly the same location, just days apart, but also that Mrs. Purdy knew all along that the girl he had been seeking had been in that very room, but callously withheld that information in order to make the rent money. Henry utilises a third-person narrator with limited omniscience to tell his story. In other words, the third-person narration is focused through the eyes of a single character, the anonymous protagonist, so that we get access to only his thoughts and feelings, while we are left to infer those of the other characters from what they say and how they act. In seeing everything from only the young man's perspective, we get a real sense not only of the isolation, alienation, and despair suffered by those transients who were swallowed up by the impersonality and lack of community of the big city, but also the dehumanization that they suffered at the hands of those such as Mrs. Purdy and Mrs. McCool, who saw them as a mere commodity from whom to make a living. At the time that Henry was living and writing in New York, the city was in a state of rapid expansion, its population having surged by 700% over the previous half-century. Not only was it the US's preeminent city, but being the first port of call for the boatloads of European immigrants disembarking on Ellis Island, New York was also the gateway to the rest of the country, and so many of its inhabitants were only there temporarily on their way to other destinations. The United States and New York City weren't only seen as a land of opportunity for those across the Atlantic, however, because the bright lights of the big city and the promise of fame in the theatres on Broadway also lured those already established throughout the country in its small towns and cities to seek fame and fortune there. Competition, however, would have been fierce and rejection common. For every Sprowls and Mooney and their 3-month stint with their vaudeville act, there would have been hundreds of disillusioned young men and women who never got their lucky break. Henry uses language skillfully to create an evocative portrait of Manhattan's impoverished Lower West Side and this transient population. Once a high-end, wealthy neighbourhood with mansions, it became a down-at-heel area, deserted by its former residents, who preferred to move uptown, away from the busy harbour, while their large homes, falling into disrepair, were converted into multiple occupancy tenements, housing waves of those nameless and faceless people who were just passing through. Henry uses this as a backdrop against which to explore themes of alienation, isolation, loneliness, and lack of identity, which he felt was symptomatic of living in a big city that was in a constant state of flux. His use of dialogue colourfully captures the different voices of the characters to evoke New York's own character as a melting pot of people from diverse backgrounds. Note how the young man speaks in formal, standard American English, suggesting that he is from a reasonably affluent and educated background, while Mrs. Purdy, the housekeeper, and Mrs. McCool both speak in the informal vernacular. Mrs. Purdy with a strong American accent suggestive of working-class origins, and Mrs. McCool with a strong Irish accent suggestive of her status as a first-generation immigrant. While there will be a suggestion that The Furnished Room is going to be a story of the supernatural, what with the creepy house and its sinister landlady who appears almost non-human, the mystery of the missing girl, the curious odour of mignonette, and Henry's references to ghosts, visitants, and haunting, the reader will come to realise through the story's twist that we don't have to go as far as the supernatural to find horror. There are plenty of monsters to be found in this plane of existence and right beneath our very noses, that are created by the dehumanizing transience of big cities and that are embodied in the unashamed callousness and cold-bloodedness of the Mrs. Purdys and Mrs. McCools of this world. The title, The Furnished Room, puts location at the very centre of the story. The room itself becomes a central character of the narrative, as it is the only thing that has any permanence in an otherwise ever-shifting world of people with no homes of their own. Henry begins the story with a couple of paragraphs of exposition by building up an evocative picture of the denizens or inhabitants of New York City's Lower West Side. Restless, shifting, fugacious as time itself, is a certain vast bulk of the population of the red brick district of the Lower West Side. Homeless, they have 100 homes. They flit from furnished room to furnished room. Transients forever. Transients in abode, transients in heart and mind. They sing Home Sweet Home in ragtime. They carry their lares et penates in a bandbox. Their vine is entwined about a picture hat. A rubber plant is their fig tree. The very first sentence begins with a triad of adjectives: restless, shifting, fugacious as time itself, all of which communicate how these people are rootless and constantly on the move with nowhere they can call home. Note the seeming paradox in the description. Homeless, they have 100 homes. In other words, because they have no permanent abode that they can call home, they end up in a succession of temporary lodgings as they flit from furnished room to furnished room. The verb flit here suggests that the way they move on is in secret, perhaps in the dead of night, as they try to avoid people to whom they owe money. This lack of permanence has an effect on their psyche and moulds their sense of identity. They are transients forever, transients in abode, transients in heart and mind, as they carry all their worldly possessions in a hat box or suitcase. At the end of this paragraph, Henry refers to the book of Micah in the Bible, chapter 4, verse 4. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. The vine and fig tree are being used as a metaphor here for a permanent home, as these are rooted in the soil, are cared for, and in return provide their owners with shelter and sustenance. These transients, however, are unable to put down roots, and the only shelter they have of their very own is the wide brim of a picture hat that they carry with them in a bandbox or hat box, and their fig tree is merely a rubber plant in a flower pot that can be transported from room to room. Note how Henry personifies these rooming houses in the second paragraph. Hence the houses of this district, having had 1,000 dwellers, should have 1,000 tales to tell, and readies the reader for the way the furnished room rented by the young man seems to become another character in the story, who attempts to tell him of all its previous occupants. Note also how Henry deliberately uses the words ghost and ghosts in the second paragraph to falsely set up his reader's expectations that this will be a story of the supernatural. But it would be strange if there could not be found a ghost or two in the wake of all these vagrant ghosts. The second example, modified by the adjective vagrant, meaning being without a settled home, refers metaphorically to these transients who don't seem to have any substance because they lack permanence, flitting as they do between temporary lodgings. In the third paragraph, Henry begins his narrative, switching from the general to the specific as he introduces one of these very transients, a young man who prowled among these crumbling red mansions ringing their bells. Note how he chooses to create a protagonist who will remain nameless throughout. He is as lacking in identity as many of the other transients who have passed through the room, and is destined to live and die a forgotten man. To the door of this, the 12th house whose bell he had rung, came a housekeeper who made him think of an unwholesome, surfeited worm that had eaten its nut to a hollow shell, and now sought to fill the vacancy with edible lodgers. Not only this, but she also is a woman whose throat seemed lined with fur. The language that Henry uses here suggests that she is some kind of unpleasant, predatory and cunning animal-like creature who has a malign intent to consume the unfortunate people who rent her rooms. The house into which the young man is ushered is dilapidated and dingy, with the carpet on the stairs being in that much of an unrecognisable condition from its original state that even the loom that created it would have disowned it, as it seemed to have become vegetable, to have degenerated in that rank, sunless air to lush lichen or spreading moss that grew in patches to the staircase and was viscid under the foot like organic matter. The landlady, however, is an inveterate salesperson, as she enthusiastically praises the room's very questionable USPs, both in terms of the calibre of its previous occupants, as she name-drops the vaudevillian performers Sprowls and Mooney, and of its facilities. It's a nice room, it ain't often vacant. I had some most elegant people in it last summer. No trouble at all, and paid in advance to the minute. The water's at the end of the hall. Sprowls and Mooney kept it 3 months. They done a vaudeville sketch. Miss Bretta Sprowls? You may have heard of her. Vaudeville was a popular type of entertainment at the turn of the 20th century in the United States of America, and featured different musical, magic and comic acts, often performed by a travelling company. Note how, with the inclusion of the fact that there was a marriage certificate hung and framed, that she is emphasising that this is a respectable establishment where no one is allowed to live in sin. With the news that Mrs. Purdy has had theatrical people rooming there, the young man asks her if she remembers a young girl, Miss Vashner, Miss Eloise Vashner. She would be singing on the stage most likely. A fair girl of medium height and slender, with reddish gold hair and a dark mole near her left eyebrow. Note how Mrs. Purdy doesn't even blink an eye as she tells him that she has no recollection of a girl of that name or description, although at this point we have no reason to believe that she's not telling the truth. From the inclusion of some further expository details, we learn that the young man has been searching for Eloise without success for the past 5 months after she ran away from home to seek fame and fortune. The way in which the city seems to be in a perpetual state of flux has reduced his quest to find her to that of a disorientating and dangerous search for a needle in a haystack, which seems to change from one day to the next. It was like a monstrous quicksand, shifting its particles constantly, with no foundation, its upper granules of today buried tomorrow in ooze and slime. The young man is left alone, and the furnished room received its latest guest with a first glow of pseudo-hospitality, a hectic, haggard, perfunctory welcome like the specious smile of a demi-rep. Henry uses a simile here to liken the room to a prostitute with a misleadingly attractive smile, who initially puts on a show of being welcoming in order to get some custom, but who, under closer scrutiny, is shown to be somewhat tired and jaded. The room seems to resonate with the voices of its previous and varied occupants. The guest reclined, inert, upon a chair, while the room, confused in speech as though it were an apartment in Babel, tried to discourse to him of its diverse tenantry. Here Henry is referring to the biblical parable of the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis, which sought to explain why the world's peoples all speak different languages, to convey the way that the condition of the room and the things that the people have left behind give a garbled and confused testimony about the different lives they have led within its 4 walls. One by one, as the characters of a cryptograph become explicit, the little signs left by the furnished room's procession of guests developed a significance. The threadbare space in the rug in front of the dresser told that lovely women had marched in the throng. Tiny fingerprints on the wall spoke of little prisoners trying to feel their way to sun and air. A splattered stain, raying like the shadow of a bursting bomb, witnessed where a hurled glass or bottle had splintered with its contents against the wall. In other words, the rug in front of the dresser has worn thin because many women have stood there, admiring themselves in the mirror, while small children have left grubby fingerprints on the walls as they have tried to break free from the room to go out and play in the open air. And a stain on the wall is evidence of a bottle or a glass of something being thrown, presumably during an argument, with some force against it. Many of the stories seem to contain violence, as though the room itself has provoked its tenants into taking out their frustrations at their chaotic and transient lives on it. It seemed that the succession of dwellers in the furnished room had turned in fury, perhaps tempted beyond forbearance by its garish coldness, and wreaked upon it their passions. The furniture was chipped and bruised. The couch, distorted by bursting springs, seemed a horrible monster that had been slain during the stress of some grotesque convulsion. Henry suggests here that it is the very condition of being without a permanent home that is to blame, i.e., that this is a fundamental human need that, if left unfulfilled, creates a sense of severe psychological stress and uncontrollable anger. It seemed incredible that all this malice and injury had been wrought upon the room by those who had called it for a time their home. And yet it may have been the cheated home instinct surviving blindly, the resentful rage at false household gods that had kindled their wrath. A hut that is our own we can sweep and adorn and cherish. Note the use of polysyndeton here, which emphasises the care and attention we are willingly able to give to something that is our very own. As the young man sits lethargically in a chair, there drifted into the room furnished sounds and furnished scents. He heard in one room a tittering and incontinent slack laughter, in others the monologue of a scold, the rattling of dice, a lullaby, and one crying dully, and so on. Note how Henry uses a transferred epithet here to suggest that the noises and smells that you experience in a furnished room are in a class of their own. The young man doesn't see any of the other tenants. All he can know of them is the muffled sounds that have filtered through the walls, and the idea of them being ghosts is once more called to mind. Henry seems to be communicating here that this sense of alienation is self-perpetuating, as these conditions are not conducive to the development of lasting human bonds and relationships, as they all lead totally separate lives, even though they live in close proximity to one another. All of a sudden, as he rested there, the room was filled with a strong, sweet odour of mignonette. It came as upon a single buffet of wind, with such sureness and fragrance and emphasis that it almost seemed a living visitant. Mignonette is a sweet-smelling flower whose essential oil is used in a number of perfumes and suggests the girl's own delicacy and innocence. Note how the fragrance is personified, having an almost tangible presence as it clung to him and wrapped him about. He reached out his arms for it, all his senses for the time confused and commingled. As readers, we have to ask ourselves whether her fragrance is really there. Is it on an item left behind? Has it come through the window or under the door from someone in a nearby room? Or is it supernatural evidence of her ghost? Or whether it is just a figment of the young man's fevered imagination. Henry deliberately leaves this ambiguous. Convinced, however, that Eloise must have been in this room, the man searches for even the smallest trace of her. But the bits and bobs he finds are either so common that they could belong to any female, or are very clearly not hers, such as a discarded, tiny ragged handkerchief which was racy and insolent with heliotrope. Another flower used in perfume making, but this time with a strong and brash fragrance, suggestive that its owner may have been somewhat of a slut. Seized with an uncontrollable urge, he combs the room from top to bottom like a hound on the scent. But he comes up with nothing that enables him to perceive that she was there, beside, around, against, within, above him, clinging to him, wooing him, calling him so poignantly through the finer senses that even his grosser ones became cognizant of the call. Note Henry's use of listing here, the cumulative effect of the multiple prepositions and present participles, suggesting how Eloise's fragrance is so powerful and all-pervasive that its sensuousness becomes sensual, as it begins to provoke a feeling of sexual as well as emotional longing in him. Frustrated that his search has come up with nothing, he goes back to the housekeeper and asks her again about the room's previous occupants. Once more she refers to Sprowls and Mooney, who left the room a week ago Tuesday, and to various others before them who bear no resemblance to Eloise. In despair, the young man crept back to his room, only to find that the essence that had vivified or brought it to life had gone. The perfume of mignonette had departed. This is the last straw, and the ebbing of his hope drained his faith. He can no longer believe that he will ever find her, and he gratefully takes his own life by stuffing all the cracks around the windows and doors with torn bedsheets and turning the gas full on in order to let it poison him. This, however, is not the end of the story. In the final brief section, we catch up with the housekeeper, who we find out is called Mrs. Purdy, and her friend Mrs. McCool, with whom she regularly drinks beer at the end of the day. Mrs. Purdy, totally oblivious that she will have the suicide of the young man to clear up the next day, triumphantly tells her that she has rented out my third floor back this evening. Mrs. McCool is suitably impressed at Mrs. Purdy's ability for renting rooms of that kind. She asks her, in a husky whisper laden with mystery, "Did you tell him then?" "Of course not," Mrs. Purdy somewhat sinisterly tells her in her furriest tones, because a furnished room's raison d'etre is, after all, to be rented. Mrs. McCool can only agree that the knowledge that someone has killed themselves in a room is likely to put a lot of people off, and she congratulates Mrs. Purdy on her business acumen, recollecting that it was only a week ago that she helped her lay out the pretty slip of a colleen who had committed suicide there with the gas. Yes, Mrs. Purdy concludes, she'd have been called handsome, as you say, but for that mole she had a-growing by her left eyebrow. So the reader now realises the true significance of the minor detail that the young man provided about Eloise's appearance right at the beginning. And the twist in the tale is that Mrs. Purdy knew all along that Eloise had been in the room only a week before, and that she was lying to him because she knew it would put him off renting it. Not because he wouldn't want to stay in a room that had seen a suicide, but because she knew his search would be over and that he would have no need for the room at all. As it is, she now has a week's rent in advance in her pocket. Her final words are chilling in the extreme as she urges her companion, "Do fill up your glass again, Mrs. McCool," as life just goes on. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques, and English literature texts.